Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
That first search of his apartment discovered the gun holster, the gun magazines, a lot of handwritten notes. The notes were read with little maps, names of women, car numbers, the photographs. In one of them, he's seen in a gas mask holding a pistol.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
It was a murder that shocked the nation, raising so many questions but very few answers. In the last episode, we explored Jill Dando's life and the events surrounding her shocking murder, shot dead, execution style, on her doorstep in Fulham. We talked to former Detective Chief Superintendent Hamish Campbell about the extensive homicide investigation which followed, and a year after the murder, how police came to believe Jill Dando was the victim of an obsessed stalker. In this second episode, we look with Hamish at the case against Barry George, who arguably fitted the profile. We'll hear about his trial and later acquittal on appeal, and we'll explore alternative theories about the crime. Martin, first of all, though, remind us of the actual story.
Jill Dando was a much-loved TV presenter. She was found shot dead on the doorstep of her home in Fulham, West London, on the morning of the 26th of April 1999. Nobody saw the murder happen. Little forensic evidence was left behind. The Met Police launched a huge investigation. It went on for more than a year, interviewing neighbours and potential witnesses, trawling through hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, eliminating suspects with a history of violence and possession of firearms, and profiling the killer, which developed a theory of a lone stalker who Jill Dando may not even have been aware of before she was so shockingly killed in cold blood.
So, Hamish, tell us about Barry George. How did he become a suspect?
Well, Barry George became a suspect following information which we'd received from two different organisations, the Taxi Office and the Hammersmith and Fulham Disability Centre. So once that individual had been traced as a real person to Barry George, and we had an address. He lived in Crookham Road at the time in Fulham, which was very near to Gowan Avenue. A detective was allocated to what we call trace, interview and eliminate that man. But in perspective, that TIE, what we call TIE inquiry, was one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And the detective who got it was one of his maybe 40, 50, 60 it had in the last year. So he went obviously to go and eliminate. And we proposed that the elimination of individuals in this inquiry had to be initially by alibi. So that's what we are seeking to do to you tell us where you were on the 26th of April in this hours, and then we can move from that. And did the individual, any individual who's being eliminated, can you prove that you have an alibi? Not everyone can, but that's what we wanted as best as possible. And so that was the task. And further, we wanted a statement. We took a statement from individuals who were being seen, so they would sign this statement as true. So the officer went a number of times to the address. Barry George wasn't at the address on occasions. I remember the officer coming to see me, said, I can't get hold of him. But here's the intelligence, here's the background on him, because he had done by then inquiry. It showed the factual behaviour of Barry George in the previous years and his previous convictions and acquittals, and the nature of the individual, how many times he had been stopped in the street. In the old days, well, even now, I hope, if you stop an individual, it had to be recorded. And every single stop by local police officers was shown there, what he was doing, the behaviour he was stopped for, etc. And he did trace the officer, George, to signing on for disability allowance or something, and picked him up from there and interviewed him. And he was interviewed in the presence of his mother. And he made a statement. George made a statement saying, yes, he did recall the date as such. He knew where he was. He was at home. He didn't know Jill Dando. He knew nothing about her. And these were questions that go for all individuals. He had no access to firearms. He didn't know anything about firearms. So he made the statement and signed, this is the position. Don't have firearms. I don't know Jill Dando. I was at home for that period of time. When that statement came back, because he was a person of interest, the officer himself was not satisfied. He fitted the description that had been provided from a year before in terms of the type of man, Mediterranean looking. He was certainly bulky with dark hair. So these small features thought, well, okay, that's odd. But significantly, the police records on him of an attempted rape conviction, an indecent assault attack, other indecent assaults which he had been either acquitted for technically because they had gone to court and then not pursued with, impersonating a police officer from years back. They were of interest. But what was interesting for me was, why would you elevate him? And no one else had been elevated. The attempted rape, although he was charged with rape and then it went to pleaded guilty to attempted rape, was on a doorstep. He followed a lady home and attacked her there in a block of flats. And the other indecent assaults had also occurred at the person's address on the way through on the doorstep. One was in a lift, and one was also in the stairwell. So it may have nothing to do with it. I'm sure there's 1,000 voices listening to your program later will go, so what? Well, maybe indeed, so what? But from an investigative perspective, from a homicide investigation, here was an individual who presented a series of features which elevated him to suspect. So I said, well, authorize a warrant. I'm authorizing it. The court are granting it. So I said, right, get a search warrant. And that first search of his apartment discovered the gun holster, the gun magazines, the photographs, which were at that time undeveloped, but still a whole series of photographs, lots of little notes, a lot of handwritten notes. So everything was retrieved. And during that recovery, that is then when there's a rapid research, the photographs are developed. And then he's seen in one of them himself in a gas mask holding a pistol. Turns out to be, it was a deactivated weapon. You can see it's been modified, but it was a starting pistol or not. We don't know because we don't have it. And then the notes were read with little maps to various individuals and names of women, car numbers. Also on the photographs were photographs of the television of TV presenters, female TV presenters, but not Jill, and aerial magazines from the BBC and some small number of cuttings. So all these elements contributed to thinking this is highly unusual. Is it relevant, though? And so that's where he became a suspect. And in my decision logs at the time, I articulated all this, and I'm sweeping over bits of it and say, right, look at Barry George in further detail. And part of that was to place him under a surveillance operation for a short while to see what did he do during the day, because we were a year behind him. So by placing him under surveillance, did that help? And so we were trying to see whether the material we had actually pointed towards him being involved or completely uninvolved. And my decision logs, which were valuable because, I did write an awful lot. The only thing I liked about Justice Gage, he said my investigation and notes were meticulous. Well, I like Justice Gage very much, but I like the thing he said, if you see what I mean. That's what, in terms of transparency, and I'm looking back now, 26 years, there was nothing I didn't write about. Everything was recorded, explained, articulated. People might not like the articulation or the explanation or the rationale I give, but that was my articulation of it. And I said, we must make, with the team, with the detective sergeants and the detective inspectors, this is my thinking. What do you think? Make him a suspect. We'll treat him as a suspect now. He can't be interviewed as a witness any longer. So if we're going to speak to George any longer, it has to be under caution. So, all right. But interview him just yet. Let's get the evidence as much as we think there is evidence. And then we came to a stage, I think between that search and his arrest was a month or just a bit over a month. And so we arrested him on suspicion of the murder.
Did you also write in your notes, Hamish, at that time that given what you found at his flat, that you had put to the far back of your mind or even dismissed finally the idea that it had been a clinical, professional killer?
It might have gone further back, there's no doubt about that, but I don't have dismissed it. Because you said that was the troubling thing in a way. There was still a whole load of other people who technically we were still pursuing or looking at or TIing, tracing, interviewing and eliminating. I think that's an issue which one has to be very aware of. But I think I'd moved away from the idea that Jill had been killed through the other scenario, the professional, organized, planned, contract, all those different adjectives, killing, yes. And I think that's the same with many an inquiry. you can follow hundreds and hundreds of different leads. 99% of them are definitely wrong. And then you do come across the one, actually, amongst all this sifting and material, the individual who may be responsible.
Hamish, tell us about the forensic evidence against Barry George. What did you find?
Well, it was limited. There's no doubt about that. And even at the time I wrote, it was a circumstantial case with some support in relation to the forensic. So we had the gunshot residue was the key thing, because he wasn't charged before the gunshot residue. The single particle of gunshot residue was discovered. The gunshot residue case is not haunted. Well, it has haunted the case in one way, because when the GSR, gunshot residue, was discovered, well, first of all, it had been discovered on the bullet, the casing, and Jill's hair a year before. So we already knew the type of GSR that had been used in that bullet. And GSR has about 5 types. And the different types are because of the makeup of aluminy, antimony, aluminium, lead. And they're different, normally the 3 metal components there. He was type 2. The gunshot residue in Jill's hair was type 2 and on the cartridge case at the scene. And recovered from the flour, of course, key bit was a coat, 3/4 length coat. The single particle of gunshot residue found in the inside pocket of the coat was type 2. Type 2 represents about 30% of the 5 types. So it was significant in that context, because he had made a statement now saying, I've never fired a gun, I've never handled weapons. So during that stage, and even at the first trial and subsequently, the first argument was it's not gunshot residue, that's firework. That is the explosive charge from an airbag. That is what railway workers use when they're setting traps on the line to warn the drivers. They're all types of GSR. So we went through a whole defense argument, and then eventually they all conceded, no, actually, it is gunshot residue. Okay, sidetracking, how did the gunshot residue get there, which we can come back to. The other tiny bit of forensic was a fiber. So when they eventually got hold of George's clothing, there was a fiber matching between Dando and George. And they test fibers through a whole range of chromatography and spectroscopy and anything else. There's 4 tests. They could only do 3 of the 4 tests. And of the 3 of the 4, it was the same. But they could never do the 4th. So it was classified as weak support for transference of a fiber. But nevertheless, it's there rather than not there. So that, the GSR. And then the other, it's not forensic, the other evidence was the ID parades. He was identified by one witness absolutely categorically as being in the street on that day, some hours before. And then the other witnesses identified someone. 2 of them were troubled and had what they call qualified identification, because he refused to go on a live parade. So he had to do photographs. And the 2 witnesses said, and I'm not sure, but these photographs you're showing me is a man wearing a beard. He'd grown that by then. But it's 2. Out of the 2, it's 2. And the judge allowed those in at the trial. So we had a series of witnesses, those witnesses from a year ago who had picked him out and said, that's the person. And one other witness had also said, I'm pretty sure it's 2, but I do not recall the man wearing a beard or moustache on the day of the murder. And she picked out 2. So you're left with what is your hard evidence? Was some people say it's not hard evidence at all. Was the single gunshot residue, the fiber, the IDs, his lies in itself is not evidence of murder. That's why I said it was circumstantial, and his failed alibi. From his statement he had made to the officer, he then said, no, I wasn't at home, I was elsewhere, and then gave this explanation for all this torturous route he had done around the area.
Even so, you've talked about the limited evidence that you presented, and it was enough to persuade the Crown Prosecution Service to charge him, put him on trial.
Yeah.
In spite of that weak case, the jury convicted him in July 2001. And I remember the conviction sparked a lot of debate at the time among legal experts and the public.
It did.
What do you remember about the public reaction then?
Well, I certainly remember it. I sensed the unease because it was almost immediately conviction and then the next day reporting on the case, conviction, and then in various commentary articles and opinion articles, oh, that's surprising. We didn't think it would be him. We thought it would be someone else sort of thing. And then it started. But I thought, oh, well, that's the way it is. I suppose I was sort of fairly practical and philosophical then. And I thought, well, you want the system done this way. There was evidence. The evidence showed, as far as the jury was concerned, 10-1. There wasn't, one juror had gone, she couldn't make it. She said whatever reason she gave to the judge, she wasn't there. Having sat through 6 weeks of the trial, she left. So we were down to 11, and then it was 10-1. I always wonder that a not guilty juror would not have left. That's my total prejudice. If I was thinking someone was not guilty, I wouldn't leave the room till I'd got my way.
In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com. Then, of course, in August 2008, after spending 7 years in prison, Barry George's conviction was overturned. What led Hamish to this, rather dramatic turn of events?
Yes, it's an odd thing because, following his conviction, he then appealed in 2002 very quickly. So a single judge said, yes, okay, go to the appeal court. And then in 2002, the judges there said no. And they articulated, it's on the website, 2002 court appeal for Barry George, guilty, conviction confirmed. And they set out all the 5 elements of the case. And then between 2002 and 2007, for 3 years, 3 and 4, there was an impasse, silence. And then the Criminal Case Review Commission took up the case. CCRC wrote to me, I supported them and helped them with everything they wanted, and some of the team still to get papers. And the defense argued 101 aspects to the case. But the thing they didn't argue was the gunshot residue. They argued that there was a miscarriage of justice for a range of different reasons in relation to the witnesses, the identity parade, procedures, etc. And the CCRC had found no grounds to return it. And towards the end of their review, that is when the Forensic Science of England, the UK Forensic Services, had provided a new guidance and interpretation of gunshot residue and how it was to be validated in terms of court hearings. Because gunshot residue is so microscopic, you can't see it with the naked eye. Well, there's many things you can't see with the naked eye. That doesn't make it no evidence. And gunshot residue is actually measured, one with a GSR, 2, 3, multiple, over 100. And they said gunshot residue of 3 or less particles really has a neutral value. There was the big debate. You can't say that just having a single piece of GSR on its own is of value to prove or not prove a point, because it could have come from anywhere. So following the CCRC's review and the new guidance on how GSR should be interpreted, it went back to the appeal court. And the appeal court listened to only one issue, GSR. They said he must have a retrial. So he was kept in custody for maybe 8 months for the trial to start. And when the second trial started, application was made by the prosecution. The junior barrister was now the lead barrister, Mr. Laidlaw, to still introduce the GSR, because the appeal court hadn't done that, hadn't said the GSR can't be introduced. If it was to be introduced, it needed to be introduced in a new way, a new interpretation. Anyway, that application was lost. The judge said, I'm not allowing GSR to be heard in this trial, but still carry on with all the other evidence that you have. The second lead defense barrister argued no case of submission. That was refused. Go to jury, and the jury not guilty. That is process. At no stage was everyone saying, no, you can't have a trial because the case against you is so weak or wrong or whatever. There was the evidence circumstantial that the law had changed by the second trial, which allowed similar fact evidence and behavior to be introduced. So we introduced a lot more of his previous stalking and all that other stuff I alluded to. And the jury says not guilty.
What was the impact of that not guilty verdict, Hamish, on your investigation and the Dando family?
The new team took the second trial. I did turn up for the second trial, but I was not part of it. So when the appeal court had said retrial, another murder team took over the case and marshaled all the material, the witnesses and new evidence, particularly relating to stalking, back for the court. So I think, like many cases, a not guilty can be, that's a decision. But, I suppose as police officers, galling as it might be at times, annoying, that's the way it is. I remember one senior detective once said to me, our job is only to bring them to the steps of the court. After that, it's down to everyone else. Our role as police officers is to investigate the best we can, honestly, thoroughly, effectively, all those things, bring them to the court. The court and the law must decide, is there a sufficiency of evidence to bring you and sit in front of you and hear these charges? No, then go home. Yes, we'll hear the charge and the jury of your peers, etc. So not guilty, then he's not guilty. And the family were always troubled, of course, but I think they're actually very philosophical about it as well.
Hamish, let me just put this cynical view to you for a moment.
Yes.
You'll have heard it many times.
Cynicism is always good.
Yes. This is the scenario. After a year of intense coverage, a lot of pressure on you, the public desperate for an arrest, you had to come up with a viable suspect, and Barry George, as a local convicted sex offender, an odd character, was a convenient scapegoat for the police. What's your response to that?
Well, my response is always very polite, but also one of puzzlement. Because, as I said earlier, I couldn't just charge someone because it's convenient. That's like a sort of the conspiratorialist theories from the outside looking in, as if somehow we really do sit round and go, oh, he will do. That's a sort of movie scenario, or some sort of dark world. This doesn't happen. Everything that happened in that case is documented and written about. Every interview is recorded on video. There's no sense of a cover-up. All the papers and reports. I have no influence over the Crown Prosecution Service, the Director of Prosecutions, or the Attorney General's office, or the senior Crown Court judge. I've seen cases, not mine, thankfully, where judges, and I've read about them, go, this is a crock of nonsense, case dismissed, either before the trial even starts or half-time. I've never known UK judges to be anything other than bold. If there was no evidence, they say, well, he's going. I don't care who Hamish Campbell is. I don't care who the Met is. But we did everything because that was the facts and the evidence, not because, oh, I'm tired. Somehow we, the organisation, were tired. Supposing Barry George hadn't come along, someone would still be investigating it, wouldn't they? That's what I mean by puzzlement, because I'm that very individual who they go, oh, he must have done it because what? I'm bored. I suppose people don't know me in the background here. My life of 25 years of investigating and more, but homicide in the last 10. It's quite interesting on reflection to think, how did I come to that decision? How do I come to following lines of inquiry and hundreds and hundreds of, not murders, hundreds of other investigations, robberies, burglaries, night invasions, stabbings, woundings. They're not all known immediately. Following process, getting evidence. And if there's another explanation, we'll have it. I'm really dispassionate like that. It had nothing to do with Barry George. Nothing at all. It had to do with, this is what we find, this is what we see. And there's a lot of things which sit behind the scenes at an investigative level, true, which make us think, I've seen liars. I know what lying looks like. I know what evasion and deception looks like, and an ability to try to avoid responsibility over years. And we just have cases and we put them forward.
Hamish, do you ever wake at night all these years later and think about this case and wonder what actually did happen? Is there still a big frustration that there's nobody in prison for the murder of Jill Dando?
I don't think this case has been out of the media one way or another for 26 years. At some level. Every year I get asked questions on it. Do I then think about that case? Of course I do. And Netflix and BBC and ITV and Channel 4 and The Times, all the newspapers asking. So I think I do reflect. But your second part of the question, do I concern myself over it that someone's not in prison? No, I've sort of, maybe it's time. I'm in my late 60s now. But even then, I'm still passionate. I'm still investigating murder here, homicide here. Different type of homicide. The last 12 years. And I see all the arguments from the other side. Somehow they feel I had some animosity. No animosity at all. What I'm really puzzled by is the views of some that identify others as responsible without any responsibility or engagement in the facts. Oh, it's him, it's this Serbian, it's that person. You think we're accused generically of producing matters without evidence. And yet other places and journalists can go, it's him, and actually name or photograph individuals without a shred of evidence. Imagine if we did that. How is that possible to then, in some papers, nominate and photograph and go, here we are? I'm just left puzzled. I'm certainly not angry about it or cross over it.
What difference do you think today's advanced forensic capabilities might have made in 1999?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we ask ourselves that all the time. I think, first of all, if the scene hadn't been contaminated as it was, that may have made a big difference in terms of the clothing and the bullet. And, afterwards just before I was leaving, 2010, 2011, a independent forensic company went through all the forensic material again, every which way, and then wrote a lengthy report just as I was leaving in 2013. But they found nothing further. They always leave the door open that maybe something could be established. And they found odd things which just didn't seem to take us anywhere. But not every single case can benefit from the vast improvements in forensic, but maybe something can. I don't know. Because all the known surfaces where it's suspected the killer must have been and touched, they were preserved and they were then re-examined in 2010-11 to see if anything could be extracted. There was nothing.
Have there been any recent efforts to reopen the investigation?
Well, you see, that is definitely outside of my knowledge now. There's a quote from the Metropolitan Police saying, until someone produces evidence, there's nothing further. We need to have some evidence. It'll be likely subject to, if it's still operating, a murder review every 2 to 3 years. Technically unsolved or unresolved cases are subject to a look-see. As they come up on a list. And if there's evidence or some new information which has merit, it will be looked at. That discrete piece will be looked at, rather than a total reopening of the investigation. That hasn't happened, no.
Hamish, thank you so much for joining us on True Criminals and talking us through in such great detail what was such a complex and high-pressure case.
It was absolutely fascinating, Martin, I think, talking to Hamish, who obviously led a very detailed and thorough investigation, and hearing him read extracts from his journal. But it strikes me that 26 years on, this is such a tragedy. We still don't know who killed Jill Dando, and there's nobody in jail for it.
It's extraordinary, the grasp of detail that Hamish Campbell still has after all these years, and I guess that's a testament to the time and effort that he and his team put into it. And it was a huge team, 65 detectives. And it wasn't just because Jill Dando was a celebrity. Often complicated murder investigations do attract that kind of resource. He was incredibly detailed in his memory and not apologetic at all for not solving it. And we didn't ask him this, but I know for a fact that in the second trial, Barry George was acquitted, and I think it's the only acquittal that Hamish Campbell has had in his career as a top murder investigator. But it doesn't bother him, he says. The evidence was there, and it was a question for the jury to decide on Barry George's guilt or otherwise. And the first jury thought guilty, the second jury decided not guilty. All murders are tragic. I felt at the time that Jill Dando was the most unlikely murder victim. And I still think that. We still don't know who did it or the motive. And I think the motive is perhaps the most intriguing thing. It seems unlikely that anybody could have had a motive for killing this highly popular, well-loved woman, TV personality, but somebody clearly had a motive. But I think the key question is whether that motive was real or whether it was a motive that was imagined in the mind of a delusional killer.
Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.